Today we're going to talk about addiction and this sort of like interesting nexus and synergy between stigma, the public narrative around addiction, and drug policy. And I have nothing to disclose. And I will say that this there's a lot of text on these slides. I think mostly because I cannibalized it from a big paper that I wrote. But a lot of it has to do with quotes, and I think that quotes are so incredibly powerful. And so I wanted to share a lot of those with you. But thank you for bearing with me. My goal is not death by PowerPoint, obviously. But the learning objectives today are to learn about the history of the prevailing public narrative surrounding drug use and addiction, learn about the implications of stigma for public health policy and federal drug policy, and learn about barriers to access for addiction care. I thought we'd start with a case because I think it always helps clinically contextualize things and kind of bring things down to earth for us clinicians out there. I obviously changed this person's name and it's de-identified. So Carlos Gonzalez is a 20-year-old gentleman with a history of opioid use disorder, major depressive disorder, unspecified anxiety, random syncope at times, sedative hypnotic use disorder, PTSD, insomnia, hypertension, who presented to one of our clinics for intake and has a previous suicide attempt. He was inpatient hospitalized for seizure activity secondary to benzodiazepine withdrawal from a predatory prescriber who has recently or subsequently had his DEA license removed and his license removed in the state of New Mexico. He was discharged from UNM inpatient care after having been tapered significantly off of the diazepam that he was on, and we continued him on methadone here for his opioid use disorder. He was a very pleasant gentleman who had been through quite a bit of trauma and recently and stated that he was very grateful to have our care and was future oriented and motivated for recovery. Our plan for him was he had made significant progress with his benzodiazepine taper, and we felt comfortable holding him on a low dose of that diazepam, continued his other discharge medicines, and believed he would benefit from dual diagnosis evaluation here, meeting one of our psychiatrists, but continued to struggle with PTSD symptoms. We enrolled him in trauma-focused therapy and encouraged psychosocial support from our case manager. And of note, he had failed an SSRI in the past. But I think it's critical to realize that when we read patient charts and we learn about people, we often lose sight of some of the more psychosocial and contextualizing factors. From talking to Mr. Gonzalez, it was clear that he was self-medicating his PTSD with benzos and opioids. Because he wound up with this predatory prescriber, I think it's fair to say that he suffered from a lack of access, or at least awareness of access to high quality medical care, and was a very vulnerable gentleman as a result of that. And I think what I'm trying to distill or clarify and bring home for all of us is that, and this is kind of the overarching theme of the talk today, is that people with addictions face significant stigma in society due to a public narrative which involves systemic racism and discrimination, illegitimate moral condemnation and criminalization of drug use is part of the more global context in which these people operate in our society. And this I think is probably one of the most interesting quotes I've ever read, and we'll probably bring it back or we'll discuss it later as well. And please keep it in mind when we discuss the Controlled Substances Act of 1970. But I'm just going to read this out, which I know is a bit boring, but maybe we can read along together. This is from John D. Ehrlichman, which is a former Nixon aide, and in his interview with Dan Baum. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies: the anti-war left and Black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. And so, again, part of the overarching theme of this talk is helping people realize, why are tobacco and alcohol, despite the fact that they kill way more people than opioids, so much more socially acceptable and even legal compared to opioids, which results in such high levels of discrimination and stigmatization and is illegal, and there's a war on drugs waged against them. And I think part of that is because a lot of this stigma has been manufactured for political reasons, etc. And this manufacturing and this sort of the racism and the politicalization and criminalization goes pretty far back in United States history, and can be traced even further back to xenophobic sentiment in the early 20th century. A 1917 Treasury Department report suggests that its major motivation for regulating marijuana was because Mexicans, and sometimes I don't like to use that word there, but smoke marijuana for pleasure, and that they could harm or assault upper class white women while under its influence. And that's part of this classic racist trope about people of color using drugs and assaulting white women and etc. In fact, in 1911, a member of California's State Board of Pharmacy believed that increased immigration had brought with it a rising demand for cannabis, and that this very undesirable lot was initiating our whites into this habit. It was part of this, nascent tradition to ostracize and persecute a targeted population of minorities, thereby shaping social structures to fit within this establishment power hierarchy and conservative ideology. I also just wanted to take a step back and learn a little bit more about stigma itself, because it occurs on multiple different levels. I think the one that applies most pertinently to opioid use disorder in our clinical practice is health-associated stigma. And that involves a socio-cultural process in which social groups are devalued, rejected, and excluded on the basis of a socially discredited health condition, which I think is clearly the case with opioid use disorder. And that also involves social subordination and jeopardizing self-determination on the part of the patient. And then there's also social and structural stigma. Social stigma is the phenomenon of large social groups endorsing stereotypes about and acting against a stigmatized group. And structural stigma involves rules, policies, and procedures of institutions which limit the rights and opportunities of stigmatized populations. I think a great example of that is how highly regulated methadone and in some cases buprenorphine is in our country, which creates barriers to access to these life-saving medications and the most evidence-based intervention for opioid use disorder. And all of these things have contributed to an overarching public narrative in our country, which describes addiction and opioid use disorder as a moral failure on the part of the user. and that the suffering experienced by the user is brought upon themselves, that they're making a choice to harm themselves, and as a result that they do not deserve help, and that in fact opioid use disorder is not a mental health disorder and not a disease, when in fact, all the evidence and research that we've seen has suggested that the disease model is viable, and that there are structural changes that occur in the brain as a result of exposure to the substance. And then Michelle Williams, who's the dean of the School of Public Health at Harvard, someone who I respect a lot, had a pretty interesting quote, which sort of corroborates what we've been talking about. And that is, stigma is a formidable barrier. Our country has ostracized, punished, and in some cases, even criminalized addiction. And that has led people who know that they need help to avoid asking for that help. Even when they do work up the courage to go in and seek that medical care, there's no guarantee that that courage will be met with the appropriate response. And so part of this call, or part of this talk, personally for me, is to enlist and help enroll you guys and recruit all the clinicians and other providers out there to help combat this stigma and make people who come to you for help feel comfortable, and recognizing that that addiction is a disease, and that often people with opioid use disorder are self-medicating underlying mental health disorders in order to escape or those negative emotions, or to numb those emotions, and that they really deserve to be treated with compassion and respect and dignity, and the need to avoid being paternalistic and discriminatory. And that's, I'm not saying that that's the case with any of you in particular, but even myself in my everyday practice, I really try to be cognizant of my own implicit bias, because I think it's there for virtually everyone on some level or another, because of this public narrative that has been manufactured and that prevails throughout our country and our society. And this is just another really interesting professor who said that stigma and discrimination around opioids to America's tortured history of race relations. Their association with poverty and minority communities prompted a response focused on criminalization rather than public health. And that persists today, where the DEA and to some extent, and a lot of the federal government's efforts have focused on criminalization, arrests, etc., rather than health-based, evidence-based services for people suffering from a disease. And this is German Lopez, who wrote for Vox for a long time, is now writing for the New York Times, but has done a lot of really interesting reporting on the opioid epidemic. I highly recommend you check out their writing, but their quote was, "Addiction has notoriously been characterized as a moral failure. The most common response I get to any addiction story argues that overdoses are just Darwin's theory in action." So sort of going back to that Nixon aide quote, Nixon helped create and signed into law the Controlled Substances Act of 1970. And what we discussed in that previous quote is what motivated the creation of the Controlled Substances Act. And it's the statute established federal drug policy under which, manufacturing, importing, possessing, use, and distribution of certain substances became regulated. And it also served as the national implementing legislation for the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. It created 5 schedules, which I'm sure you're all familiar with for those of you who are prescribers, with varying qualifications for substances to be included in each. And it also included the creation of the DEA and the FDA to determine which substances are added to or removed. um, and scheduled things like marijuana, et cetera. So what's happened in the 50 years since the Controlled Substances Act and going into place, I think, as we are probably pretty well aware, drug offenses are the leading cause of arrest in the US, leading to the not small problem of mass incarceration. Black and Latino people have been disproportionately targeted for drug war enforcement. It has not reduced drug overdose deaths. In fact, many people would argue that making drugs illegal, and particularly opioids, has made them more potent and more dangerous, and has included costs. The war on drugs has included costs in the billions of dollars, and many would argue has become a war not on drugs, but a war on people themselves who are suffering from addiction. So there are many other international models where people, including in France, Switzerland, Australia, Portugal, most recently also here in Oregon in the United States, but the Portuguese model stood out. I had the privilege of going to a conference there a few years ago and seeing what they've done in action. They suffered from a devastating opioid epidemic in the 80s, not unlike ours, with high rates of overdose and HIV and HCV transmission. And what they did in terms of policy was to decriminalize the individual possession of small amounts of all drugs. So they didn't legalize like the trafficking of drugs, for example, but for an individual possession who had like a gram or less of cocaine or heroin, for example, so it was clear that they were using it for individual use, they decriminalized that. And so if you did get caught by the police, et cetera, with a gram of heroin, instead of going straight to jail or having contact with the criminal justice system, which we often know is unhealthy on many levels, they went to meet with a social worker who first decided whether or not they had a diagnosis of addiction. And if they did, then they were encouraged to go into treatment rather than incarceration. They also made methadone and other treatments such as buprenorphine widely available, whereas as we know in the US, methadone and Suboxone remain relatively restricted by cumbersome federal regulations which reduce access to these life-saving treatments. And in doing these two things, deregulating treatment and decriminalizing individual possession of drugs, the Portuguese were able to successfully combat their opioid epidemic. And this is in contrast to the United States, where we've had 4 decades of rising fatal drug overdose rates, and instead have employed a criminal approach via the war on drugs. So other steps which I think are other countries have taken and it would be worth our time here and our money in the United States are redirecting resources to fund research and health services like evidence-based treatments, harm reduction, and housing, removing outdated harmful restrictions on methadone and buprenorphine, which decrease access to care, and repealing laws that restrict employment and educational opportunities, deny access to housing, voting rights, and governmental nutritional programs like WIC, and cost people their children or immigration status based on drug arrest or conviction. So how am I doing on time, Julie? Okay.
I guess that was vague. Yeah, that was a vague thumbs up. I mean, 5 more minutes is about,
okay, great.
I mean, but if we don't have any cases, then I would say you could go for like 10. And then we
okay, yeah. And I think we can also have a talk or we can do questions and have a dialogue if we don't have a case as well. So this slide is a little bit dated, but basically in Oregon, they did exactly what I just described in Portugal, and that they decriminalized the individual possession of small amounts of all drugs. And so they are diverting people away from incarceration and into evidence-based treatment. And they've also used the taxes from legalized marijuana to fund social services and addiction treatment for people that need it. And while they don't have super longitudinal data on that yet, and the data is a little bit unstable, it's looking like things are really moving in a positive direction in Oregon as a result of these policies. So I think that's pretty exciting and could be used as a model in other states. So I just wanted to reiterate, that it will be difficult to adequately respond to our pressing national crisis as long as substance use disorders are conflated with moral and criminal issues. People with opioid use disorder, as a result, are not able to get the care that they need and deserve. Therefore, the societal stigmatization of drug use has created a systematic disparity in health outcomes for those with addiction, namely fatal overdose deaths. I also wanted to just bring up an interesting quote from Ben Ray Lujan, our state senator, recently. And he said that, this is a matter of life and death. Patients with access to medication-assisted treatment are half as likely to die from an opioid use disorder. Congress must take advantage of every opportunity to increase access to medication-assisted treatment. This is why I'm introducing the Mainstreaming Addiction Treatment Act, which would address this issue by eliminating the redundant and outdated requirement that practitioners apply for a separate waiver through the DA to prescribe buprenorphine. And I think it was this type of pressure which ultimately contributed to the SAMHSA and the DA deciding to remove additional regulations recently towards the end of last year. And I think we're slowly starting to permeate on a federal government level that, we cannot allow stigma and a profound lack of awareness about medication-assisted treatment or medications for opioid use disorder to kill more people in this country. I'll go through this one because I think this is a nice one, but I'm a little bit worried that I have a little bit too much text for you all, but in effect, the pernicious public narrative around addiction has created health inequity based on different levels of underlying social advantage/disadvantage, that is wealth, power, or prestige. Stigmatization robs people suffering from substance use disorders of their social status and in turn of their political capital, as reflected by the inadequate federal policy response to the opioid epidemic. And I guess that's my closing concept that I wanted to leave you guys with. And I have some references here, and I also wanted to open it up to questions. Thank you for bearing with me through a somewhat kind of academic, text-heavy talk. And are there any questions that people would like to discuss at the moment?